The Vexani council chambers felt like a tomb. The massive room that once buzzed with peaceful debates now echoed with the sound of incoming disaster reports. Commander Thalanos stood before the central holographic display, watching red warning. Light spread across the galaxy map like drops of blood in water. Each red dot represented a dead world, a civilization wiped out by the advancing Morvac Empire intelligence chief. Valkyra's hands shook as she read the latest casualty report. Her voice cracked with emotion as she announced the numbers that nobody wanted to hear. 17 billion souls had been exterminated on Kepler Station in just 3 days. The Morvac weren't interested in prisoners or slaves. They wanted complete annihilation of every species that wasn't them. The council chamber held representatives from 12 different peaceful species. They had built their alliance on trade, culture, and mutual respect. Their military forces existed mainly for show, designed to patrol trade routes and rescue stranded ships. They had never prepared for anything like this. How could they? The Morvac war machine operated with the efficiency of a plague, consuming everything in its path and leaving behind nothing but empty, scorched planets. Their combined fleets, once a source of pride that demonstrated unity between different worlds, had lasted less than a week against the Morvac advance. The alien warriors didn't just defeat their enemies, they studied them, learned their weaknesses, and then systematically destroyed them with scientific precision. Every battle plan the Peaceful Alliance tried was anticipated and countered within hours old. Counselor Rendali had lived through 200 years of peace and prosperity. His species had evolved past the need for violence generations ago, but now, facing the complete extinction of everything he had worked to build, he found himself considering an option that would have been unthinkable just months before. His aged voice trembled as he spoke about the one possibility they had all been avoiding. The room went dead silent when someone whispered the word that terrified most galactic civilizations: Deathworlders. Every species in the chamber knew about the third planet, orbiting a yellow star called Sol. The creatures living there existed on a world so dangerous that their entire evolution had been shaped by constant threat, whether that could kill, predators that hunted in packs, diseases that swept across continents, and natural disasters that could wipe out entire regions without warning. Ambassador Fexrin's objection echoed what everyone was thinking. These humans were basically animals that had somehow developed space travel. Their world was classified as a Class 1-2 Death World, the highest rating possible. Most species couldn't survive there for more than a few hours. Even with life support equipment, the fact that an entire civilization had evolved on such a hostile planet was almost beyond comprehension. The classified files that Commander Thalanos accessed painted a picture of a species that seemed designed for warfare. Their history was an unbroken chain of conflicts stretching back thousands of years. They fought over water, land, resources, ideas, and sometimes just because they didn't like each other. Even more disturbing were reports of their military training, where soldiers practiced by actually fighting each other with weapons designed to cause pain without permanent damage. But the most chilling aspect of the human files was how they seemed to enjoy conflict. Other species fought when necessary for survival or resources. Humans appeared to fight for entertainment, creating elaborate games that simulated warfare and competitions that tested combat skills. They told stories about their greatest warriors and celebrated those who had excelled in battle. The debate in the council chamber stretched for hours. Some argued that calling the humans would simply be trading one form of destruction for another. At least the Morvac were predictable in their brutality. Humans were unknown, unpredictable, and possibly even more dangerous than their current enemies. What if they answered the distress call but decided they liked what the Morvac were doing? What if they joined the winning side instead of helping the losing one? Others pointed out that they were facing complete extinction anyway within months. Every peaceful species in the galaxy would be dead. Their children, their culture, their entire history would be erased as if they had never existed under those circumstances. Even a small chance of survival was worth considering, no matter how dangerous the potential allies might Beatty's final vote was closer than anyone had expected. Many council members abstained, unable to make a decision that could doom their species either way, but in the end, desperation won over caution by just over 200 votes. The distress beacon they launched that night was simple and honest. They didn't try to explain the complex political situation or provide detailed military analysis. They just sent a basic message that any intelligent species could understand. We are dying and we need help. What the Vexani didn't realize was that their message wasn't going into empty space, hidden on the edge of their system. A human monitoring station had been quietly watching and listening for 50 years. The humans had been studying galactic civilization, learning languages, mapping territories, and preparing for the day when they would make contact. Captain Jake Morrison was finishing his night shift when the distress call came through the communications array. He had been monitoring alien transmissions for 3 years, mostly listening to boring trade negotiations and cultural exchanges. This was different. This was exactly what Earth's military planners had been expecting. A situation where humanity's unique skills might actually be needed. He read the message twice to make sure he understood it correctly, then activated the secure communication link that would carry his report back to Earth at faster than light speed. His voice was steady and professional as he delivered news that would change human history forever. The galaxy had finally asked for help from the Deathworlders, and humanity had been ready to answer that call for a very long time. The emergency session in the Vexani Council chambers felt different this time. Where before there had been desperate hope, now there was growing terror. The intelligence reports scattered across the table painted a picture of humanity that made even their current enemies look civilized by comparison. Commander Villanos read through the intercepted data. With increasing horror, the humans had something called recreational combat, where they actually fought each other for fun, not simulated battles or strategic games, but actual physical combat with rules designed to prevent permanent damage, while still allowing real violence. Even worse, their children participated in activities they called war games, using weapons that fired projectiles at high speed. What kind of species taught their young to be warriors before they could even properly walk? The cultural analysis reports were equally disturbing. Humans had developed thousands of different ways to compete with each other, many involving simulated or controlled violence. They celebrated warriors in their entertainment, created detailed, fictional scenarios about warfare, and seemed to find the entire concept of conflict genuinely exciting rather than terrifying. Most peaceful species viewed war as a tragic necessity at best. Humans appeared to view it as a fascinating challenge. Chief Valkyra activated the holographic display to share the most chilling discovery. They had managed to intercept actual human military communications during what appeared to be a training exercise. The translated voice that filled the chamber was calm, almost casual, as it reported the elimination of hostile forces in a specific grid location. But what made everyone in the room go cold was the next part. Civilian casualties were considered acceptable as long as they stayed under 15%. The delegates looked at each other in stunned silence. These weren't the words of reluctant defenders or desperate survivors. These were the calculated statements of professional killers who had turned warfare into a precise science. They discussed the deaths of innocents the same way other species might discuss shipping schedules or weather patterns. Counselor Rendley's voice was barely above a whisper as he suggested what everyone was thinking. Maybe they should try to cancel their request for help. Maybe facing extinction at the hands of the Morvac would be preferable to whatever the humans might do to their galaxy. But deep down, they all knew it was too late. The message had been sent, and there was no way to take it back. The human response arrived exactly 3 days later, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of coming through normal diplomatic channels with proper introductions and formal protocols, it bypassed every security system they had and appeared directly on their military communications network. The fact that the humans could penetrate their defenses so easily was almost as frightening as the message itself. Admiral Tom Walker's voice carried the kind of authority that made it clear he was used to being obeyed. Without question, there were no diplomatic pleasantries, no expressions of sympathy for their situation, and no reassurances about peaceful intentions, just a straightforward demand for detailed military intelligence that would give the humans complete knowledge of their defensive capabilities and strategic positions. When Commander Thelanos tried to slow things down and establish proper diplomatic procedures, Walker's response was immediate and uncompromising. He spoke about time as a tactical factor, about every delayed hour costing lives, and made it clear that the humans viewed this as a military operation rather than a rescue mission. Either the Vexani would provide the requested intelligence immediately, or the humans would withdraw their offer of assistance. The tactical analysis that came back after the humans reviewed their data was the most terrifying thing anyone in the council had ever heard. The humans had calculated acceptable casualty rates for civilian populations they had never met, and knew nothing about 12 to 18% losses for a rapid military solution, or 43% casualties over 6 months if they took a more cautious approach. The recommendation for immediate evacuation of contested zones was delivered in the same tone someone might use to suggest rearranging furniture. Valakor stared at the communication device as if it might explode at any moment. Her voice shook as she asked the question that everyone was thinking. What kind of species could calculate acceptable losses for people they had never seen, in cities they had never visited, fighting a war they had no stake in? The humans were treating entire worlds like pieces on a game board, moving populations around to minimize casualties in the same way other species might optimize trade routes. But while the Vexani leadership was questioning their decision to call for human assistance, something interesting was happening on the other side of the galaxy. Morvac intelligence networks, which had spent centuries perfecting the art of intercepting enemy communications, were picking up fragments of human military chatter, and for the first time since their empire began its campaign of conquest, the Morvac war machine was experiencing something completely unfamiliar. Uncertainty that intercepted communications made no sense according to their understanding of how civilized species conducted warfare. Humans discussed acceptable casualty rates the way other species talked about lunch preferences. They treated entire star systems as tactical problems to be solved rather than populations to be conquered. Most disturbing of all, the human soldiers seemed genuinely excited about the upcoming conflict, discussing battle strategies with the enthusiasm that other species reserved for festivals or cultural celebrations. Emperor Gorthmak had spent 3 centuries building his empire by understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. He could predict how any civilized species would respond to threats, ultimatums, or military pressure, but the human communications contained no fear, no desperate attempts at negotiation, and no signs of the panic that usually preceded a species surrender. Instead, there was something that sounded disturbingly like anticipation. The Morvac intelligence analysts had no framework for understanding a species that seemed to look forward to warfare rather than dread it. In their experience, advanced civilizations fought only when necessary and sought to end conflicts as quickly as possible. The humans appeared to be approaching the situation like a complex puzzle they were eager to solve, discussing tactical challenges and strategic opportunities with obvious intellectual curiosity. For the first time in his long career of conquest, Emperor Gorthmak found himself wondering if his empire might have finally encountered something it couldn't understand, predict, or defeat. The humans were coming, and nobody in the galaxy, not even their desperate allies, had any idea what that really meant. The only certainty was that everything was about to change in ways that no one could imagine. The Morvac's 7th Fleet had turned the space around the Vexani homeworld into a killing field. Over 2,000 warships hung in the darkness like metal predators, their weapons systems glowing with deadly energy. Each ship represented decades of military engineering and centuries of conquest experience together. They formed the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen. Emperor Gorthmak stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final preparations with the satisfaction of someone who had never known defeat. This would be his 48th conquered star system, and he expected it to fall just as easily as all the others. The Vexani had no military worth mentioning, and their desperate call for help had brought only a small force of unknown aliens from the edge of civilized space. The tactical displays showed the approaching human fleet as tiny dots against the vast emptiness of space. 200 ships against over 2,000. The Emperor had seen species attempt desperate last stands before, but this was almost insulting. Did these primitive creatures really think such a small force could make any difference against the might of the Morvac Empire? When his communications officer announced that the human fleet commander was requesting to speak with him, Gorthmak almost laughed out loud. He had been expecting either a surrender offer or perhaps some pathetic attempt at negotiation. Either way, it would be amusing to see how these Deathworlders planned to beg for mercy. The human who appeared on his main screen was completely unremarkable. Admiral Walker looked like exactly the kind of soft, weak creature that the Emperor expected from a species that had never faced real adversity. His uniform was plain gray, with minimal decoration, his appearance ordinary, and his expression utterly calm. There was nothing about him that suggested he commanded anything more dangerous than a merchant convoy. Gorthmak decided to be generous and offer the humans a chance to surrender before he destroyed them. After all, primitive species might have some value as servants or laborers if they could be properly trained. But the humans' response was so unexpected that it left the entire Morvac bridge crew speechless for several seconds. 30 minutes to withdraw all forces from Vexani Space 1, warning the sheer audacity of it was almost beyond comprehension. This tiny fleet, outnumbered 10 to 1, was demanding that the galaxy's most powerful military force retreat. The Emperor's officers began laughing because the alternative was to believe that the human was actually serious, but Admiral Walker's expression never changed even when Gorthmak explained the obvious reality of their situation, pointing out the massive numerical advantage and the Morvac Empire's perfect record of conquest. The human simply continued his countdown, 29 minutes, 40 seconds, as if time somehow mattered when the outcome was already decided. The Emperor tried one more approach, offering to let the human species serve as auxiliary forces if they surrendered immediately. It was more generosity than most conquered species received, but Walker just kept counting down, treating the Emperor of the galaxy's most feared empire like a minor inconvenience rather than a force of nature. That's when something strange started happening on the tactical displays. The human ships were moving, but not in any formation that made sense according to established military doctrine. Instead of organizing into battle lines or defensive positions, they were spreading out seemingly at random throughout the star system. Some moved toward the outer planets, others positioned themselves near asteroid fields, and a few actually seemed to be heading away from the main battle zone. Gorthmak's tactical officers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't just poor strategy. It was complete chaos. The humans were abandoning any pretense of coordinated defense and scattering like frightened animals. It was almost disappointing. He had hoped for at least some entertainment before the inevitable conclusion. When Admiral Walker announced that time was up, the Emperor prepared to give the order for his fleet to demonstrate proper warfare to these primitive creatures. But then something happened that would change his understanding of combat forever. The human ships didn't charge forward in a glorious but doomed attack. They didn't attempt to use superior tactics to overcome impossible odds. They didn't try any of the conventional strategies that desperate species usually employed in their final moments. Instead, they simply vanished. One moment, the tactical displays showed 200 enemy vessels spread throughout the system. The next moment, they showed empty space. Every human ship had disappeared from sensors simultaneously, as if they had never existed at all. The Morvac technology that could track objects across entire star systems suddenly found nothing to track. Gorthmak, his first thought was that the humans had retreated, using some kind of advanced faster-than-light drive to escape before the battle began. It would be disappointing, but at least it would prove they had more sense than courage. But then his flagship's defensive systems activated automatically, responding to incoming weapons fire from a source that didn't exist the first. Morvac ships began exploding before anyone could even figure out what was attacking them. Energy blasts materialized from empty space, struck with devastating precision, and then disappeared again, as if they had been fired by ghosts. The Emperor's sensors showed no enemy vessels, no energy signatures, and no indication of where the attacks were coming from. New voice joined the communications channel, young and confident, with an almost casual tone that made it clear the speaker was enjoying herself. Captain Lisa Reed introduced herself and her ship, then delivered a message that would haunt Morvac military commanders. For generations, this was what humans called a teaching moment, and the galaxy's most powerful empire was about to learn some very hard lessons about warfare. The human ships materialized just long enough to unleash devastating attacks, then vanished again. Before return fire could even be calculated, they moved through space like predators stalking prey, appearing where they were least expected, and striking at the exact moments when the Morvac formations were most vulnerable. Every attack was coordinated with surgical precision, turning the Empire's own tactical advantages against them. For the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, Emperor Gorthmak experienced genuine fear. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they fought like nothing anyone had ever imagined. What followed wasn't really a battle at all. It was more like watching a master craftsman demonstrate their skills to confused apprentices for 18 straight hours. The Morvac Empire's most elite forces were systematically taken apart by an enemy that seemed to know exactly what they were going to do before they did it. Captain Mike Johnson weaved his fighter through what used to be the flagship's protective escort. Twisted metal and debris from dozens of Morvac warships floated through space like a graveyard of broken dreams. His voice was calm and professional as he reported to command, already moving on to assist ground forces, while his enemies were still trying to figure out what had hit them down on the planet's surface. Things were going even worse for the Morvac ground troops. They had expected to face panicked civilians, and maybe some poorly equipped local defenders, making a desperate last stand instead. They ran into human marines, and the difference was like watching house cats try to fight tigers. Sergeant Lisa Chen moved through the wreckage of what had been a major Morvac defensive position. Just a few hours earlier, the enemy soldiers sprawled around her were massive creatures, 8 feet tall, and built like living tanks. They had been bred specifically for combat over generations, designed to be the perfect warriors, but they lay scattered around the battlefield like discarded toys, completely outclassed by humans who had learned to fight on a world that tried to kill them every single day. The most shocking thing for the wounded Morvac officer wasn't that he had lost. It was that the human medic was actually treating his injuries instead of finishing him off. In Morvac culture, wounded enemies were simply eliminated. The concept of showing mercy to a defeated opponent was so foreign that his brain couldn't process what was happening. Chun's explanation was simple, but carried the weight of millions of years of evolution. Behind it, humans had been dealing with threats like the Morvac since their species first developed intelligence. The only difference was that humanity had learned something the Morvac never did. Individual strength meant nothing without the ability to work together effectively high above the battlefield. Commander David Martinez orchestrated the entire operation from his command ship, while other species relied on rigid military hierarchies, where orders flowed from the top down. Human forces operated more like a living organism. Every soldier understood not just their own mission, but how their actions fit into the larger strategy. When situations changed, they adapted instantly without waiting for new orders. The reports flowing back to Admiral Walker painted a picture of complete tactical dominance. The primary population centers were secured with minimal civilian casualties. The enemy fleet was falling apart as individual ships tried to retreat or fight alone. Instead of working together, what should have been a desperate last stand was turning into a textbook example of how superior coordination could overcome any numerical advantage. The thing that other galactic species couldn't grasp was that humans hadn't just evolved as predators. They had evolved as pack hunters, who specialized in taking down prey much larger and stronger than themselves. Every human soldier was trained to think like an independent operator, while maintaining perfect synchronization with their team. They didn't just follow orders blindly. They understood the reasoning behind those orders and could modify their approach based on changing conditions. Emperor Gorthmak sat trapped in his command center, watching his empire's perfect record of conquest crumble. In real time, his flagship was crippled, his fleet was scattered, and his ground forces were surrendering faster than his communications officers could process the reports for 3 centuries. The Morvac had been the galaxy's ultimate predators, and now they were learning what it felt like to be prey. When Admiral Walker appeared on his screen again, he wasn't alone. The medical officer standing beside him was proof of something. The Emperor was beginning to understand these humans weren't just better warriors. They were better at everything. They could fight with devastating efficiency, and then immediately switch to healing the wounded. They could destroy an empire in hours, and then worry about minimizing civilian casualties. The choice Walker offered was simple and final: complete withdrawal from all Vexani territory, or the humans would stop holding back and demonstrate what they could really do when they weren't trying to minimize collateral damage. The implication was clear. Everything that had happened so far had been the humans being careful and restrained. Looked at his tactical displays one more time, trying to understand how his supposedly primitive enemies had accomplished in 18 hours what no other species had managed in 3 centuries. The numbers didn't lie. The galaxy's most powerful military force had been decisively defeated by a fraction of its size in ships and personnel. When he asked what they were, the human medical officer's answer hit him like a physical blow. Dr. Angela Ross explained that humans were what happened when apex predators developed empathy instead of just using their abilities for personal gain. They were living proof that the Morvac Empire could have chosen a different path, could have used their strength to build instead of destroy. The idea that his species could have become something better, something that used power to protect instead of conquer, was almost too much for the Emperor to process. His entire worldview was built on the assumption that strength meant the right to dominate others. The humans had just proved that real strength came from choosing to help others even when you had the power to crush them. For the first time in Morvac history, their Emperor gave an order to retreat, not a tactical withdrawal or a strategic repositioning, but a complete acknowledgement of defeat. The message went out across all military channels: abandon all positions in Vexani space and return to Imperial territory immediately. The galaxy's balance of power had shifted in a single day. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they had rewritten the rules of interstellar conflict forever. No species would ever again assume that technological superiority or numerical advantage guaranteed victory, and more importantly, no species would ever again underestimate the power of cooperation over conquest. The age of human influence in galactic affairs had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 months after the Battle of Vexani Prime, visitors to the star system could hardly believe they were looking at the same place. The smoking craters and mass burial sites had been replaced by gleaming medical centers, educational facilities, and reconstruction hubs that hummed with activity around the clock. What had once been a war zone now looked like the foundation of a new civilization. Colonel Jennifer White walked through the medical facility that had been built where the Morvac command center once stood. The transformation was symbolic, in more ways than one, where alien conquerors had once planned the destruction of entire populations. Now human doctors and Vexani medical staff worked side by side to heal anyone who needed help, regardless of which side they had fought on. The site that confused most alien observers was the treatment wing dedicated to captured Morvac soldiers. These were the same warriors who had slaughtered billions of innocent civilians just months before. Yet human medical staff treated their injuries with the same care and attention they gave to Vexani refugees. Dr. Zelinaris, the Vexani chief medical officer, couldn't understand this contradiction. White paused in her examination of a young Morvac warrior who had been pulled from the wreckage of a transport ship. The soldier was barely conscious, his reptilian features twisted with pain, but the human medical team worked to save his life with the same dedication they showed to every patient. Her explanation was simple, but carried profound implications for how the galaxy understood civilization itself. The philosophical challenge this presented to other species was enormous. Here was proof that a single species could be devastatingly effective in warfare while simultaneously showing mercy that seemed to border on madness. How could the same people, who had dismantled the galaxy's most powerful military force in 18 hours, then spend months carefully nursing their enemies back to health? Admiral Walker had set up his temporary command center in the same chambers where the Vexani Council had once debated whether to call for human help. Now he worked directly with Commander Thalanos to coordinate relief efforts across 17 different star systems that had been liberated from Morvac. Controlled. The scale of the operation was massive, but it was being managed with the same precision and efficiency that had characterized the military campaign. Thalanos found himself constantly amazed by the contradictions in human behavior. The same soldiers who had fought like demons during the battle now shared their food rations with enemy prisoners and spent their off-duty time helping rebuild destroyed cities. It seemed impossible that such extreme behaviors could coexist in the same species. Explanation touched on something fundamental about human evolution and survival. Strategy humanity had learned through millions of years of trial and error that raw strength alone wasn't enough to guarantee long-term survival. Intelligence meant knowing when violence was necessary and when cooperation would achieve better results. The strongest predator wasn't always the one who could kill the most prey. Sometimes it was the one who could build alliances and work with others effectively. But perhaps the most remarkable development came when Captain Robert Johnson's engineering teams began working with Vexani technicians to rebuild their infrastructure. The humans weren't just repairing the damage caused by the war, they were actively improving everything they touched, sharing technological advances that were centuries ahead of anything the galaxy had. Previously, Sinvokora watched human engineers patiently explain the construction of fusion reactors with safety features that seemed almost magical to her people. The humans were freely giving away technological advantages that could have made them the dominant species in the galaxy when she asked why they would share such valuable knowledge. Johnson's response revealed something profound about human strategic thinking. The concept of strong neighbors making for a strong neighborhood was revolutionary to most galactic species. Traditional thinking suggested that keeping potential rivals weak was the best way to maintain power. Humans had somehow figured out that helping others become stronger actually made everyone more secure in the long run. The most shocking moment came when Emperor Gorthmak himself requested a private meeting with Admiral Walker. The former ruler of the galaxy's most feared empire arrived, expecting either execution or permanent imprisonment instead. He found himself sitting in a comfortable office, drinking something humans called coffee, and having what could only be described as a friendly conversation. Gordon's confusion was understandable. In 3 months, the humans had completely dismantled his empire, liberated dozens of star systems, and freed billions of enslaved beings, yet they hadn't claimed a single planet for themselves, hadn't demanded tribute from the species they had saved, and hadn't even established permanent military bases in strategic locations. Walker's explanation of human intentions was both simple and revolutionary. Humans wanted the Morvok to become better than they had been. The Emperor's people had tremendous potential as engineers, scientists, and explorers, but they had gotten trapped in the belief that conquest was easier than creation. The humans were offering them a chance to discover what they could accomplish when they focused on building instead of destroying. The implicit threat in Walker's words was clear but delivered without malice. Species that chose to remain predators in a galaxy that was trying to evolve beyond simple survival would find themselves increasingly isolated and eventually eliminated. But this wasn't a threat of human aggression. It was a natural consequence of refusing to adapt to changing circumstances 6 months later. The establishment of the Morvock Reconstruction Authority proved that even the galaxy's most violent species could change when given proper guidance and motivation. Former military commanders, who had once planned genocidal campaigns, now worked to rebuild the civilizations they had destroyed, learning new forms of strength from their human mentors. The galaxy watched this transformation with amazement and growing hope. Humanity had taken its place in galactic civilization, not as conquerors, but as something far more powerful, living proof that apex predators could evolve beyond simple survival and become forces for creation rather than destruction. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they had brought with them the most dangerous weapon imaginable, hope for what intelligent species could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conquest. The universe would never be the same again.